of a fall of LTALF in the value or price of the elements of productive capital would be that the capital value that has to be T advanced for business X, continued on the same scale as before, would be reduced by half, and so business X would also have to cast only half as much money into the market, since it is in the form of money, i.e. as money capital, that business X originally advances this capital value. The quantity of money cast into circulation would decline, because the price of the elements of product Tion had fallen. This would be the first effect. Secondly, however, half of the capital value of £900 originally advanced, i.e. £450, which either, a. alternately passed through the forms of money capital, productive capital and commodity capital, or b. existed simultaneously and contiguously partly in the form of money capital, partly as productive capital and partly as commodity capital, would be precipitated out from the circuit of business X and would therefore enter the money market as additional money capital, and function there as an additional component. This £450 set free in money functions as money capital not because it is money that has become superfluous for the conduct of business X, but rather because it is a component of the original capital value, hence continues to operate as capital and is not spent as a mere means of circulation. The most direct form in which it can be made to operate as capital is if it is placed on the money market as money capital. Alternatively, the scale of product Tion could be doubled, ignoring the fixed capital. A production process of double the scale could then be conducted with the same capital advance of £900. If the prices of the fluid elements of the productive capital were to rise by a half, on the other hand, so that, instead of £100 a week, £150 was necessary, and thus £1,350 instead of £900, then £450 of additional capital would be needed in order to carry on business on the same scale, and this would exert a proportionate pressure on the money market, greater or less according to its condition. If all capital available on it was already taken up, then there would be increased competition for available capital. If a part of it lay idle, then it would be proportionately called into action. But there can also be a third case, when, with a given scale of production, given velocity of turnover and given prices of the elements of 362 the turnover of capital fluid productive capital, the price of the products of business X falls or rises. If th price of the commodities supplied by business X falls, then the price of its commodity capital of £600, which it is constantly casting into circulation, sinks to £500, for example. Thus a sixth of the value of the capital advanced does not return from the circulation process, the surplus value concealed in the commodity capital is left out of consideration here, it is lost in it. But since the value or price of the elements of production remains the same, this reflux of £500 is only sufficient to replace 5/6 of the capital of £600 engaged in the production process. £100 of additional money capital must be advanced, therefore, if production is to be continued on the same scale. Conversely, if the price of the products of business X rose, then the price of the commodity capital would rise from £600 to, say, £700. A seventh of its price, £100, does not derive from the production process, was not advanced to it, but rather flows in from the circulation process. But still only £600 is needed to replace the productive elements, and so £100 is set free. The reason why in the first case the turnover pp. Read is reduced or prolonged, and in the second case the prices of raw materials and labor, in the third case the prices of the products supplied, rise or fall, does not belong within the orbit of our investigation so far. What does belong here, however, is this, case 1. Scale of production remaining the same, constant prices of elements of production and products, change in the period of circulation and hence in the turnover period. On the assumptions of our example, 1/9 less total capital is needed as a result of the reduction in the circulation period, so that this capital is reduced from £900 to £800, and £100 in money capital is precipitated out. Business X continues to supply the same 6-weekly product with the same value of £600, and, since work continues uninterruptedly throughout the year, it turns out in 51 weeks the same quantity of products, with a value of £5,100. Thus, as far as the quantity and price of the product that the business casts into circulation is concerned, no change takes place, and so neither is there a change in the terms on which it is put on the market. But £100 is precipitated, since by reducing the circulation period the process can be completed with a capital advance of £800, instead of £900 as previously. The £100 of capital that has been precipitated exists in the form of money capital. But this effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 363 is in no way the same part of the capital advanced that always had to function in the form of money capital. Let us suppose that, of the fluid capital I equals £600 that was advanced, 4/5 was always laid out on materials of production, making £480, and I equals £120 on wages. Capital 2 equals £300 must therefore be similarly divided into T equals £240 for material elements of production and 1 equals £60 for wages. The capital laid out on wages must always be advanced in the money form. As soon as the commodity product, to the sum of £600, has been transformed back into the money form, has been sold, £480 of it can be transformed into material elements of production, into a productive stock, but £120 maintains its money form, to serve for 6 weeks' payment of wages. This £120 is the minimum part of the returned capital of £600 which must always be replaced and renewed in the form of money capital, and hence mu5 greater than t always be present is a part of the capital advanced which functions in the money form. Now if, of the £300 that is periodically set free for 3 weeks, and is also divisible into a productive stock of £240 and wages of £60, £100 is precipitated out in the form of money capital as a result of the reduced circulation time, being completely withdrawn from the turnover mechanism, the question arises, where does the money for this £100 money capital come from? Only a fifth part of it consists of the money capital periodically set free within the turnovers. The remaining T, equals £80, has already been replaced by additional productive stock of the same value. By what means is this additional productive stock transformed into money, and where does the money for this conversion come from? If the reduction in the circulation time has already taken place, then only £400 out of the above £600, instead of £480, is transformed back into a production stock. The remaining £80 is kept in its money form and composes, together with the above £20 for wages, the £100 of capital precipitated. Even though this £100 is derived from the circulation sphere by the sale of the £600 commodity capital, and is now withdrawn from this, insofar as it is not laid out again on wages and materials of production, it should not be forgotten that, in the money form, it is once more in the same form as that in which it was originally cast into circulation. At the beginning, £900 in money was laid out on production stock and wages. In order to keep the same production process going, only £800 is now needed. The £100 thus precipitated out in the money form now constitutes a new money capital seeking investment, a new element on the money market. Certainly, it already 364 the turnover of capital existed periodically in the form of money capital set free, and in the form of superfluous productive capital, but these latent states were themselves conditions for the accomplishment of the process, as preconditions of its continuity. Now they are no longer needed, and therefore form new money capital and a component of the money market, even though they are in no way either a superfluous element of the existing social money stock, since they existed at the start of the business and were cast into circulation by it, or a newly accumulated hoard. This £100 now really is withdrawn from circulation, inasmuch as it is a part of the money capital advanced that is no longer applied in the same business. But this withdrawal is only possible because the transformation of commodity capital into money and of this money into productive capital, CMC, has been accelerated by a week, so that the circulation of the money engaged in this process is also similarly accelerated. It has been withdrawn from circulation because it is no longer needed for the turnover of capital X. It is assumed here that the capital advanced belongs to the person who uses it. It would however in no way change things if it were Bore Road. With the reduction in the circulation time, only £800 of Bore Road capital would be needed instead of £900. If £100 were repaid to its lender, this would once again form additional money capital, only it would be in Y's hands instead of X's. Furthermore, if capitalist X receives his material elements of production, to the value of £480, on credit, so that all he has to advance himself in money is £120 for wages, he would now have to obtain on credit an amount of the material elements of production to the value of £80 less, which is therefore so much additional commodity capital for the credit-giving capitalist, while capitalist X has also precipitated out £20 in money. The additional production stock is now reduced by 1/3. It was previously £240, 4/5 of £300, the additional capital II. It is now only £160, L. Additional stock for 2 weeks instead of 3. It is now replaced every 2 weeks instead of every 3, but this is stock only for 2 weeks instead of for 3. Purchases, on the cotton market, for instance, are repeated more frequently and in smaller quantities. The same amount of cotton is withdrawn from the market, since the quantity produced remains the same. But the withdrawal is differently distributed in time, and over a longer period. Let us assume, for instance, that there was originally a renewal of the production stock every 3 months and a subsequent reduction of the renewal time to effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 365 2 months. The annual consumption of cotton is 1,200 bales. In the first case, sales were as follows: the 1st of January 300 bales, leaving 900 bales in the warehouse the 1st of April. 300. 600. The 1st of July. 300. 300. The 1st of October 300. In the second case, on the other hand, we have the 1st of January. 200 bales sold, leaving 1,000 in the warehouse the 1st of March. 200. 800. The 1st of May. 200. 600. The 1st of July. 200. 400. The 1st of September 200. 200. The 1st of November 200. The money invested in cotton, therefore, only completes its return 1 month later, in November instead of in October. Thus if, as a result of the reduction in the circulation time, and hence in the turnover, 1/9 of the capital advanced, L. £100, is precipitated out in the form of money capital, and this £100 is composed of £20 that was a periodic excess money capital for the payment of wages, and £80 that previously existed as a periodic excess production stock for 1 week, then, corresponding to this £80 reduction in the surplus production stock on the part of the manufacturer, there will be an increased commodity stock in the hands of the cotton broker. The same cotton lies as much longer in the broker's warehouse as a commodity, as it exists for a shorter time as a production stock in the stores of the manufacturer. We previously assumed that the reduction in circulation time in X's business depended on X selling his commodity more quickly, or else being paid for it more quickly, on a reduction in the length of credit. Such a reduction is based on reducing the time for the sale of the commodity, for the transformation of commodity capital into money capital, CM, the first phase of the circulation process. It could also arise, however, from the second phase MC, from a simultaneous alteration either in the working period or in the circulation time of capitals Y, Z, etc., which supply capitalist X with the elements of production of his fluid capital. If cotton, coal, etc., for instance, took 3 weeks with the old means of transport to travel from their place of production or their depot to the site of capitalist X's place of production, hen the neonymum pro 366 the turnover of capital ductive stock that X had to hold pending the arrival of new stocks had to be sufficient for at least 3 weeks. As long as cotton and coal are in transit, they cannot serve as means of production. They form instead the object of labor for the transport industry and the capital employed in it, and commodity capital in circulation for the coal producer or the cotton broker. Now let improved means of transport reduce the journey to 2 weeks. The production stock can then be transformed from a 3-week supply to one of 2 weeks. An additional capital of £80 that was advanced is now set free, and so is £20 for wages, because the capital of £600 completes its turnover and returns 1 week sooner. If on the other hand the working period of the capital that supplies the raw material is reduced, as in the examples given in the previous chapters, then it also becomes possible to replace the raw material in less time. This then permits a reduction in the productive stock, and a shortening in the time between one replacement period and the next. If, inversely, the circulation time and hence the turnover period is prolonged, an advance of additional capital is needed. This comes from the pockets of the capitalist himself, if he possesses extra capital. But this will have been invested in some form or other as part of the money market. In order to make it available, it must be prized out from its old form, e.g. shares sold, deposits withdrawn, so that here too there is an indirect effect on the money market. Alternatively, the capitalist has to raise the capital. As far as the part of the capital needed for WAG S is concerned, in normal circumstances this is always advanced as money capital, and to this extent capitalist X exerts his share of direct pressure on the money market. For the part to be invested in raw materials etc., this is only indispensable if he has to pay cash. If he can get it on credit, then he does not exert a direct influence on the money market, as the additional capital is then advanced directly as a productive stock, and not in the first instance as money capital. In so far as his creditor directly puts the bill received from X back into the money market, has it discounted, etc., this has an indirect, second-hand effect on the money market. But if he uses this bill to meet a debt that he has later to settle, then this additionally advanced capital has neither a direct nor an indirect effect on the money market. Case 2. Change in price of the materials of production. All other circumstances being unchanged, we have just assumed that, of the total capital of £900, T equals £720 is laid out on material elements of production, and 1 equals £180 on wages. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 361 if the price of raw materials etc. falls by half, then these require only £240 for the 6-week working period, instead of £480, and only £120 in additional capital too, instead of £240. Capital I is now reduced from £600 to 240 plus 120 equals £360, and capital II from £300 to 120 plus 60 equals £180. The total capital of £900 is reduced to 360 plus 180 equals £540. £360 is thus precipitated. This precipitated money capital, which is now unoccupied and is therefore seeking investment on the money market, is simply a fragment of the capital of £900 originally advanced as money capital which has now become superfluous owing to the fall in price of the elements of production into which it is periodically transformed. That is if the business is not expanded, but rather continued on the old scale. If this fall in price was not due to accidental circumstances, a particularly good harvest, oversupply, etc., but to an increased productivity in the branch of industry that supplies the raw material, then the unoccupied money capital would be an absolute addition to the money market, an absolute addition to the capital available in the form of money capital, because it has ceased to form an integral component of the capital already invested. Case II-1. Change in the market price of the product itself. In the case of a fall in price, a part of the capital is lost and has therefore to be replaced by a new advance of money capital. This loss for the seller may be recouped by the buyer directly, if the market price of the product has been affected only by accidental conjunctures, and the price subsequently rises again to its normal levi. Indirectly, if the change in price has been brought about by a change in value reacting on the old product, and if this product again enters another sphere of production as an element of production, and sets free a proportionate amount of capital there. In both cases, the capital lost by X, capital which he endeavors to replace by exerting pressure on the money market, can be supplied by his business friends as new additional capital. There is then only a transfer. If the price of the product rises, on the other hand, then a portion of capital that was not advanced is appropriated from the circulation sphere. This is not an organic part of the capital advanced in the production process, and if production is not extended, it forms precipitated money capital. Though it is assumed here that the prices of the elements of the product were given before the latter entered the market as commodity capital, this price increase could still have been caused by real 368 the turnover of capital change in value, to the extent that this had a retroactive effect, e.g. if raw materials had subsequently risen in value. In this case, capitalist X would have profited both on his product, circulating as commodity capital, and on his existing production stock. This profit would then supply him with the additional capital he now needs to carry on his business as a result of the increased prices of the elements of production. Alternatively, the price rise might be only transitory. What one capitalist then needs as extra capital is precipitated out elsewhere to the extent that his product forms an element of production for other branches of business. What the one lost, the other has gained. Chapter 16. The turnover of variable capital. The annual rate of surplus value. Let us take a circulating capital of £2,500, with 4/5 of this, £2,000, being constant capital, material elements of production, and 1/5, £500, being variable capital, capital laid out on wages. Let the turnover period be 5 weeks, the working period 4 weeks and the circulation period 1 week. Capital I is then £2,000, consisting of £1,600 constant capital and £400 variable capital. Capital II is £500, of which £400 is constant capital and £100 variable. In each working week, a capital of £500 is laid out. In a year of 50 weeks, an annual product of 50 times 500 equals £25,000 is produced. The capital I of £2,000 that is applied in each working period thus turns over 12 times 2,000 equals £25,000. Of this £25,000, T equals £20,000 as constant capital, laid out on means of production, and T equals £5,000 is variable, laid out on wages. The total capital of £2,500, on the other hand, turns over £25,010. Equals tunes. 2,500 The variable circulating capital expended in the course of production can serve again in the circulation process only to the extent that the product in which its value is reproduced is sold, transformed from commodity capital into money capital, so that it can be laid out anew in payment for labor power. But this is just the same for the constant circulating capital laid out in production, on materials, whose value also reappears as a portion of the value of the product. What these two parts of the circulating capital, the constant and the variable, have in common, and what distinguishes them from fixed capital, is not that the value they have transferred to the product is circulated by commodity capital, circulates through the circulation of the product as a commodity. A portion of the product's value, and hence of the product itself circulating as a commodity, of the commodity capital, always consists of the wear and tear of the fixed capital, or the part of the fixed capital's value that it has transferred to the product in the course of production. The difference is rather that the fixed capital continues to 370 the turnover of capital function in the productive process in its old shape through a longer or shorter cycle of turnover periods of the circulating capital, equals circulating constant plus circulating variable capital, while any single turnover has as its precondition the replacement of the entire circulating capital that enters the circulation sphere from the production sphere in the shape of commodity capital. The first phase of circulation CM, is common to both fluid constant and fluid variable capital. In the second phase these separate. The money into which the commodity is transformed back is partly converted into a production stock, circulating constant capital. According to the different terms of purchase of the components of this stock, one part of the money may be converted into materials of production earlier, another part later, but eventually it goes into these completely. A further part of the money released by the sale of the commodity remains in the form of a money reserve, to be spent bit by bit in payment for the labor power incorporated into the production process. It forms the circulating variable capital. Nonetheless, the entire replacement of one or the other part derives each time from the turnover of the capital, its transformation into a product, from product into commodity, and from commodity into money. This is the reason why, in the previous chapter, we could treat the turnover of both constant and variable capital together as a separate theme, without regard to the fixed capital. For the question that we have to deal with now, we must go one step further and treat the variable part of the circulating capital as if it alone formed the circulating capital. In other words, we shall disregard here the constant circulating capital that turns over together with the variable capital. £2,500 has been advanced, and the value of the annual product is £25,000. But the variable part of the circulating capital is £500, hence the variable capital contained in the £25,000 is £5,000. If we divide the £5,000 by £500, then we get the number of turnovers, 10, just as with the total capital of £2,500. This average calculation, in which the value of the annual product is divided by the value of the capital advanced and not by the value of that part of this capital that is constantly applied in a particular working period, i.e. in this case not by 400 but by 500, not by capital I, but rather by capital I plus capital I, is here, where only the production of surplus value is at issue, absolutely exact. We shall see later on, though, that from another point of view it is inexact, just as this average calculation in general is not quite exact. It is sufficient for the practical purposes. The turnover of variable capital 371 of the capitalist, but it does not adequately or precisely express all the real circumstances of the turnover. Up to now we have completely left out of account one part of the value of the commodity capital, i.e. the surplus value contained in it, which is produced during the production process and has been incorporated into the product. This is what we have now to turn our attention to. Let us assume that the variable capital of £100 laid out each week produces a surplus value of 100% equals £100. Then the variable capital of £500 laid out in the course of the turnover period of 5 weeks produces a surplus value of £500, i.e. half of the working day consists of surplus labor. But if a variable capital of £500 produces £500, then 5,000 produces a surplus value of 10 times 500 equals £5,000. The variable capital advanced, however, as £500. The ratio of the total surplus value annually product to the value of the variable capital advanced, we call the annual rate of surplus value. In the present case this is 5,000. Equals 1,000%. 500. If we analyze this rate more closely, it is clear that it is equal to the rate of surplus value that the variable capital advanced produces during one turnover period, multiplied by the number of turnovers of the variable capital, which is the same as the number of turnovers of the total circulating capital. The variable capital advanced in one turnover period is £500 in the present case, and the surplus value produced in it is also £500. The rate F I dot D dot H 500's 100 surp SVAUE in one turnover perla is T error equals per 500 V cent. This 100% multiplied by 10, the number of turnovers in the 5,000s year, gives equals 1,000%. 500 V. This holds for the annual rate of surplus value. But as far as the mass of surplus value obtained during a particular turnover period is concerned, this is equal to the value of the variable capital advanced during this period, here £500, multiplied by the rate of surplus value, here 500x. 100 equals 500 times 1 equals £500. If the capital advanced was £1,500, with 100 the same rate of surplus value, then the mass of surplus value would be 101, 500x equals £1,500, 100,372. The turnover of capital, the variable capital of £500 which turns over 10 times in the year, producing an annual surplus value of £5,000, its annual rate of surplus value thus being 1,000%, we shall call capital A. Let us now suppose that another variable capital B of £5,000 is advanced for a whole year, i.e. here for 50 weeks, and hence turns over only once in the year. 372. The turnover of capital, the variable capital of £500 which turns over 10 times in the year, producing an annual surplus value of £5,000, its annual rate of surplus value thus being 1,000%, we shall call capital A. Let us now suppose that another variable capital B of £5,000 is advanced for a whole year, i.e. here for 50 weeks, and hence turns over only once in the year. We further assume that the product is paid for at the end of the year on the same day that it is finished, so that the money capital into which it is transformed returns the same day. The circulation period here is now 0. The turnover period is the same as the working period, L. 1 year. As in the previous case, a variable capital of £100 is in the labor process each week, hence £5,000 in 50 weeks. The rate of surplus value is also the same, 100%, L. With a working day of the same length, half of this consists of surplus labor. If we take 5 weeks, then the variable capital applied is £500, the rate of surplus value 100%, and the mass of surplus value created during the 5 weeks is therefore £500. The amount of labor power that is exploited, and the degree of its exploitation, are exactly the same here, on the assumptions made, as in capital A. In any 1 week, the variable capital of £100 that is applied produces a surplus value of £100, and so in 50 weeks the capital of 50 by 100, equals £5,000, produces a surplus value of £5,000. The mass of surplus value annually produced is the same as in the previous case, £5,000, but the annual rate of surplus value is quite different. Here the surplus value produced during the year divided by the variable capital advanced as 5,000 equals 100%, whereas for capital A it was 1,000%. 5,000 V. In the case of both capital A and capital B, we have the expenditure of £100 variable capital each week. The degree of valorization or the rate of surplus value is the same, %, and the magnitude of the variable capital is also the same, £100. The same amount of labor power is exploited, and the degree and scale of exploitation are in both cases the same. The working days are equal, and similarly divided into necessary labor and surplus labor. The sum of variable capital AP applied during the year is equally large, £5,000, and sets the same amount of labor in motion, while the same mass of surplus value is extracted from the labor power set in motion by the two equal capitals, £5,000. Yet there is a difference of 900% in the annual rate of surplus value between A and B. This phenomenon makes it appear, moreover, as if the rate of the turnover of variable capital 373 plus value did not depend only on the amount of variable capital and the rate of exploitation of the labor power set in motion by it, but also on inexplicable influences deriving from the circulation process, And in fact the phenomenon has been interpreted in this way, if not in this pure form, then at least in its more complicated and concealed form, that of the annual rate of profit. Since the beginning of the 1820s, this phenomenon has led to the complete destruction of the Ricardian school. However, its strangeness immediately disappears if we really do place capitals A and B in exactly the same conditions, and do not just appear to do so. The same conditions obtain only if the variable capital B is wholly spent on payment of labor power in the same interval of time as capital A. The £5,000 of capital B is then paid out in 5 weeks, £1,000 per week, giving an outlay of £50,000 over the year. The surplus value is now also £50,000, under our assumptions. The capital turned over, £50,000, divided by the capital advanced, £5,000, gives the number of 5,000's turnovers, 10. The rate of surplus value equals 100%, 5,000 V multiplied by the number of turnovers, 10, gives the annual rate of 50,000's 10 surplus value. Equals 1,000%. The annual rates of 5,000 V. 1 surplus value for A and B are now the same, L. 1,000%, but the mass of surplus value is, for B, £50,000, for A, £5,000. The masses of surplus value produced are now in the same ratio as the capital values B and A that were advanced, L. 5,000 to 500 equals 10 to 1. This is the reason why capital B could set 10 times as much labor power in motion in the same time as capital A. It is only the capital actually operating in the labor process which creates surplus value and to which all the laws given for surplus value apply, including the law that, with a given rate of surplus value, the mass of surplus value is given by the relative magnitude of the variable capital. The labor process itself is measured by time. The length of the working day being given, as it is here, where we assume equality between capital A and capital B in all circumstances, in order to present the difference in the annual rate of surplus value in a clear light. See Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1 II, Chapter 20. TSEE Volume 1, Chapter 13. 374 The turnover of capital working week consists of a definite number of working days. Alternatively, we can treat each working period, e.g. here a 5-week one, as a single working day, of 300 hours, for example, if the working day is 10 hours and the week 6 working days. We must then multiply this figure by the number of workers who are employed alongside one another each day in the same labor process. If this number was 10, for example, then the weekly total would be 60 times 10 equals 600 hours, and a 5-week working period would amount to 600 times 5 equals 3,000 hours. Variable capitals of the same size are thus applied if, with the same rate of surplus value and the same length of working day, equal amounts of labor power, one labor power of the given price multiplied by the given number of workers, are set in motion in the same interval of time. Let us now return to our original examples. In both cases, A and B, equal variable capitals, £100 per week, are applied each week of the year. The variable capitals that are applied and actually function in the labor process are therefore the same, but the variable capitals advanced are quite unequal. With A, £500 is advanced every 5 weeks, and £100 of this is applied each week. With B, £5,000 has to be advanced for the first 5-week period, but out of this only £100 per week, and thus in these 5 weeks only £500 equals 110 of the capital advanced, as actually applied. In the second 5-week period, £4,500 has to be advanced, but only £500 is applied, and so on. The variable capital advanced for a certain period of time is transformed into AP applied, i.e. really functioning an effective, variable capital, only to the degree that it actually does enter those sections of the period of time in question that are filled by the labor process, and really does function in this labor process. In the intervening period in which a part of it is advanced for application only at a later date, this part is as good as non-existent for the labor process, and thus does not have any influence on the formation of either value or surplus value. Take capital A of £500, for instance. It is advanced for 5 weeks, but each week only £100 of it successively enters the labor process. In the first week, 1/5 of it is applied. 4/5 is advanced without being applied, although since it must be on hand for the labor process of the 4 following weeks it must certainly be advanced. The circumstances that differentiate the ratio between the advanced and the applied variable capital affect the production of surplus value. At a given rate of profit, only insofar as they differentiate the amount of variable capital which can actually be applied in a definite period of time, e.g. in 1 week, 5 weeks, etc. The variable capital advanced. The turnover of variable capital 375 functions is variable capital only to the extent that it is actually applied, and during the time for which it is applied, not during the time in which it remains advanced in reserve without being applied. But all circumstances that differentiate the ratio between advanced and applied variable capital can be summed up in the difference in turnover periods, determined by a difference either in working periods or in circulation periods, or in both. The law of surplus value production is that, with the same rate of surplus value, equal amounts of FW1 stationing variable capital create equal masses of surplus value. So if equal amounts of variable capital are applied by capitals A and B for the same space of time at the same rate of surplus value, Then they must produce equal MO1 TS of surplus value in this time, no matter how different may be the ratio between the variable capital applied in the time in question and the variable capital advanced during the same time, and hence how different also the ratio between the mass of surplus value produced and the total variable capital advanced, rather than that actually applied. The variation of this ratio, instead of contradicting the laws put forward for the production of surplus value, rather confirms these and is an inescapable consequence of them. Let us consider the first 5-week production period of capital B. At the end of week 5, £500 has been applied and consumed. The value product is £1,000, 500s, equals 100%. It is just the same with capital A 500V. The fact that capital A has realized its surplus value along with the capital advanced, while B has not, is of no importance to us here, where the issue is simply the production of surplus value and its ratio to the variable capital advanced during its production. If on the other hand we calculate the ratio of the surplus value in B to the total capital of £5,000 advanced, and not to the part of this capital that is applied during its production and hence consumed, then we get 500s equals 10.5, OV 10%. That is, 10% for capital B as against 100%, 10 times as much, for capital A. If it be said here that this difference in the rate of surplus value for capitals of equal magnitude, which have set in motion an equal quantity of labor, and moreover labor that is divided into the same portions of paid and unpaid labor, contradicts the laws of surplus value production, the answer is simple, and given by a mere glance at the factual relations. For it is the actual rate of surplus value that is expressed here, i.e. the ratio of the surplus value produced 376 the turnover of capital during 5 weeks, by a variable capital of £500 to this variable capital of £500. For B, on LCHE other hand, the mode of reckoning is one that has nothing to do W. Th either the production of surplus value or the corresponding determination of the rate of surplus value. The £500 surplus value which has been produced by the variable capital of £500 is in fact not calculated on the basis of the £500 variable capital that is advanced during its production, but rather on a capital of £5,000, 9/10 of which, i.e. £4,500, has nothing at all to do with the production of this surplus value of £500, but is rather designed to function gradually over the course of the following 45 weeks, and does not exist at all as far as the production of the first 5 weeks goes, which is all that we are concerned with here. In this case, therefore, the difference in the rate of surplus value between A and B is no problem at all. Let us now compare the annual rates of surplus value for capitals A and B. For capital B we have 5,000s equals 100%, for capital A, 5, OV 5,000s equals 1,000%. The ratio of the surplus value rates, however, 500V is still the same as before. Then we had surplus value rate for capital B, surplus value rate for capital A, and now we have annual rate of surplus value for capital B, annual rate of surplus value for capital A. 10%, 100%, 100%, dot, 1000%, but 10%, 100%. %, 1000%, the same ratio as before. For all that, the problem has now been turned round the other way. I. Dot. 1. 5. 000's DE annual rate lor capita B equals 100%, O's not present 5000V the slightest divergence. Not even the shadow of a divergence. From the jaws of surplus value production which we already knew, and the rate of surplus value corresponding to these, 5000V has been advanced during the year and productively consumed, having produced 5000s. The rate of surplus value is thus the above fraction 5000s equals 100 per 5, OV. The turnover of variable capital 377 cent. The annual rate of surplus value agrees with the actual rate. This time it is not capital B that presents the anomaly to be explained, as it did last time, but rather capital A 5, 000's. Here we have the rate of surplus value equals 1000%, but 500V if in the first case 500 s. The product of 5 weeks was calculated on a capital advance of £5,000, 9/10 of which was not applied in its production. Now 5 OZ is calculated on the basis of 500 V, i.e. on only 1/10 of the variable capital that was really applied in the product Tion of 5 OS. For the 5 OZ is the product of a variable capital of £5,000 that is productively consumed over 50 weeks, and not of the capital of £500 used during one single 5-week period. In the first case, the surplus value produced during 5 weeks was calculated on the capital that was advanced for 50 weeks, i.e. a capital 10 times greater than that used during the 5 weeks. Now the surplus value produced in 50 weeks is calculated on the capital which was advanced for 5 weeks, and which is thus 10 times smaller than that used during the 50 weeks. Capital A of £500 is not advanced for any longer than 5 weeks. At the end of this period it returns, and can repeat the same process 10 times in the course of the year by turning over 10 times. 2 things follow from this. Firstly, the capital advanced in case A is only 5 times greater than the portion of capital applied in any 1 week's production process. Capital B, on the other hand, which turns over only once in 50 weeks, must therefore also be advanced for 50 weeks, and is 50 times greater than the part of the capital that can ever be applied in 1 week. The turnover time thus modifies the ratio between the capital advanced for the production process during the year and the capital applied for any given production period, e.g. a week. And this gives us the first case, in which the surplus value of 5 weeks is reckoned, not on the capital applied during these 5 weeks, but rather on the 10 times greater capital that is applied over 50 weeks. Secondly, the turnover period of capital A, 5 weeks, comprises only 1/10 of the year. The year therefore includes 10 such turnover periods, in which capital A of £500 is each time applied afresh. The capital applied here is equal to the capital advanced for 5 weeks, multiplied by the number of turnover periods in the year. The capital applied during the year is 500 times 10 equals £5,000. The capital advanced during the year is 5,000, 10 equals £500. In point of fact, even though the 378 the turnover of capital £500 is always applied afresh, never more than the same £500 is applied every 5 weeks. In the case of capital B, it is still only £500 that is applied and advanced for these 5 weeks. But since the turnover period is now 50 weeks, the capital applied during the year is the same as the capital advanced not for every 5 weeks, but for 50. The mass of surplus value produced annually, however, is governed, at a given rate of surplus value, by the capital applied during the year, and not by that advanced. Thus, it is no greater for this capital of £5,000 that turns over once than it is for the capital of £500 that turns over 10 times, and the only reason why it is the size it is that the capital that turns over once in the year is itself 10 times greater than that turning over 10 times. The variable capital turned over during the year. The part of the annual product or the annual expenditure equal to this part is the variable capital actually applied and productively consumed in the course of the year. It follows therefore that, if the variable capital A turned over annually and the variable capital B turned over annually are the same, and they are applied under the same conditions of valorization, the rate of surplus value must be the same for both, and since the masses of capital applied are the same, so must be the annually reckoned rate of surplus value, as long as it is expressed as mass of surplus value annually produced annual turnover of variable capital. To express it more generally, whatever may be the relative magnitudes of the variable capitals turned over, the rate of surplus value that they produce in the course of a year is determined by the rate of surplus value at which the respective capitals have operated in average periods, e.g. on a weekly or even daily average. This is the only possible result that follows from the laws of surplus value production and those determining the rate of surplus value. Let us now look once again at what the ratio annual turnover of capital advanced expresses. We are dealing here only with the variable capital, as already stated. The quotient gives the number of turnovers of the capital advanced in 1 year. £5,000 capital annually turned over L. For capital A we have lor £500 capital advanced. Single quote. The turnover of variable capital 379. IB £5,000 capital annually turned over capita. £5,000 capital advanced in both ratios. The numerator expresses the capital advanced multiplied by the number of turnovers. For A, 500 by 10, for B, 5,000 by 1. Alternatively, the capital is multiplied by the reciprocal of the turnover time, reckoned in terms of a year. The turnover time for A is la year, the reciprocal of this is 11 degrees. And 500x, 0. Equals 5,000. For B, 5,000 xt equals 5,000. The denominator expresses the capital turned over multiplied by the reciprocal of the number of turnovers. For A, 5,000 x la. For B, 5,000 xt. The respective quantities of labor, the sum of the paid and the unpaid labor, that are set in motion are the same here, since the capitals turned over are the same, and so are their rates of valorization. The ratio between the variable capital annually turned over and that advanced indicates, firstly, the ratio in which the capital to be advanced stands to the variable capital applied in a certain working period. If the number of turnovers is 10, as under A, and the year is taken as 50 weeks, then the turnover time is 5 weeks. This 5 weeks is the time for which variable capital has to be advanced, and the capital advanced for 5 weeks must be 5 times larger than the variable capital applied during 1 week. That is to say, only 1/5 of the capital advanced, here £500, can be applied in the course of a week. In the case of capital B, on the other hand, where the number of turnovers is T, the turnover time is 1 year equals 50 weeks. The ratio of the capital advanced to that applied week by week is therefore 50 to 1. If the situation was the same for B as for A, then B would have to apply £1,000 each week instead of £100. Secondly, it follows that B has applied a capital 10 times as great as A, i.e. £5,000, in order to set in motion the same amount of variable capital, thus, with a given rate of surplus value, the same quantity of labor, both paid and unpaid, and thus to produce the same mass of surplus value in the course of the year. The real rate of surplus value expresses nothing more than the ratio of the variable capital applied in a given period of time to the surplus value produced in the same period, or the mass of unpaid labor that the variable capital applied during this time sets in motion. It has absolutely nothing to do with the portion of variable capital that is advanced during the time in which it is not applied, and hence just as little to do with the ratio between the part of it advanced for a definite period of time and that applied during the same period, a ratio which is modified and differentiated by the turnover period. 380. The turnover of capital. It rather follows from what has already been developed that the annual rate of surplus value coincides with the real rate of surplus value, that which expresses the degree of exploitation of labor, only in a single case, namely when the capital advanced turns over only once in the year, so that the capital advanced is equal to the capital turned over during the year, and the ratio of the mass of surplus value product during the year to the capital applied during the year for the purpose of this production coincides and is identical with the ratio between the mass of surplus value produced during the year and the capital advanced for the year. A. The annual rate of surplus value is mass of surplus value produced during the year BH. F. 1. Dot. Ut te mass 0 surplus variable capital advanced value produced during the year equals the real rate of surplus value multiplied by the variable capital applied in its production. The capital applied for the production of the annual mass of surplus value is equal to the capital advanced multiplied by the number of its turnovers, which we shall call N. The formula A is thus transformed into B. The annual rate of surplus value is real rate of surplus value x variable capital advanced x NC. I. E.g. lor capita variable capital advanced 100% x 5000 by 1 ONI. F. 1. Dot. FHB. Or 100%. YIN equals, i.e. I. TE 5000 variable capital advanced turns over only once in the year, and is thus equal to the capital applied or turned over in the year, is the annual rate of surplus value equal to the real rate of surplus value. Let us call the annual rate of surplus value S, the real rate of surplus value S, the variable capital advanced V and the number of turnovers N. S of N then S equals Sn. Le. S equals Sn and only equals S, if N equals 1, when versus S equals S x1 equals S. It follows that the annual rate of surplus value is always Sn, i.e. the real rate of surplus value produced in a turnover period by the variable capital consumed during this period, multiplied by the number of turnovers of this variable capital during the year, or, what is the same thing, multiplied by the reciprocal of its turnover time, reckoned on the basis of a year. If the variable capital turns over 10 times in the year, then its turnover time is 1/10 of a year. The reciprocal of this is therefore equals 10. The turnover of variable capital 381. It follows further that S equals S, if N equals 1. S is greater than S, if N is greater than 1. Le. If the capital advanced turns over more than once in the year, so that the capital turned over is greater than that advanced. Finally, S is smaller than S, if N is less than 1. Le. If the capital turned over during the year is only one part of the capital advanced, and the turnover period thus lasts for longer than a year. Let us pause a moment to consider this last case. We keep all the assumptions made in our earlier example, but simply extend the turnover period to 55 weeks. The labor process demands £100 in variable capital each week, and thus £5,500 for the turnover period, and each week it produces 1 U. S. S is thus 100%, as before. The number of turnovers is now equals F, since the TWN over time is 1 plus low years, the year taken is 50 weeks, equals T. Years. S. Single quote. 100% by 5500 xh 110. 1009 N10. Equals. Dash. X it equals tit percent, i.e. 5500. 11 less than Lu percent. In point of fact, if the annual rate of surplus value were 100%, then 5,500 V would have to produce 5,500 S in a year, whereas it actually now takes H years for this. The 5500 V produces only 5 U's in the course of the year, giving an annual rate of 5,000's 10 surplus value of equals 98%. 5 of 11 the annual rate of surplus value, or the comparison between the surplus value produced during the year and the total variable capital advanced, as distinct from the variable capital turned over during the year, is therefore not something merely subjective, but a comparison produced by the actual movement of capital itself. For the owner of capital A receives back at the end of the year his variable capital of £500 together with a surplus value of £5,000. What expresses the size of the capital he has advanced is not the quantity of capital that he has applied during the year, but that which periodically flows back to him. That the capital may exist at the end of the year partly as a production stock, and partly as commodity or money capital, adds nothing to the question in hand. Nor does the ratio in which it is divided between these various portions. The owner of capital B receives back £5,000, his capital advanced, together with £5,000 surplus value. The owner of capital C, that of £5,500 last introduced, has produced £5,000 surplus value during the year, £5,000 outlay with a rate of surplus value of 100%, but his capital advanced has not yet returned to him, and so neither has the surplus value it has produced. 382 The turnover of capital S equals Sn expresses the fact that the rate of surplus value on the variable capital applied during a turnover period, mass of surplus value produced during a turnover period variable capital applied during a turnover period has to be multiplied by the number of turnover periods or reproduction periods of the variable capital advanced, the number of periods in which it repeats its circuit. We have already seen in Volume 1, Chapter 4, the general formula for capital, and again in Chapter 23, Simple Reproduction, how the capital value is always advanced and not genuinely spent, in that once this value has gone through the various phases of its circuit, it returns again to its starting point, and, moreover, it does so enriched with surplus value. This is what characterizes it as advanced. The time that elapses between its point of departure and its point of return is the time for which it is advanced. The entire circuit which the capital value undergoes, measured by the time from its advance to its reflux, forms its turnover, and the duration of this turnover is a turnover period. Once this period has elapsed, the circuit is at an end, and the same capital value can begin the same circuit afresh, and thus also valorize itself afresh and again produce surplus value. If the variable capital turns over 10 times in the year, as it does, then the mass of surplus value produced in the course of the year will be 10 times that corresponding to one turnover period. The nature of the advance must now be investigated from the standpoint of capitalist society as a whole. Capital A, which turns over 10 times during the year, is advanced 10 times in the course of the year. It is advanced afresh for each new turnover period. But at the same time, all that the owner of ever advances during the year is the same capital value of £500, and all that he ever has at his disposal for the production process we are considering is £500. Once this £500 has completed a circuit, he lets the same circuit begin anew. Capital by its very nature only maintains its capital character precisely by functioning as capital in ever-repeated production processes. It is never advanced for longer than 5 weeks. If the turnover lasts for longer, this capital is not sufficient. If it is reduced, then a part of the capital is superfluous. It is not 10 capitals of £500 that are advanced, but one capital of £500 advanced 10 times in succession at different intervals of time. Hence the annual rate of surplus value is not calculated on a capital of £500 advanced 10 times, on £5,000, but the turnover of variable capital 383 rather on a capital of £500 advanced once. Just as, when a shilling circulates 10 times, there is still only 1 shilling in circulation, even though it performs the functions of 10 shil 1 ings. However, no matter in whose hand it exists for the moment, it remains as always the same identical value of 1 shilling. Capital A shows in just the same way, each time it returns, including its return at the end of the year, that its owner has always operated simply with the same capital value of £500. All that he receives back each time is £500. The capital he advances is therefore never more than £500. The capital of £500 that is advanced forms the denominator of the fraction that expresses the annual rate of surplus value. We already had, for this the formula S equals SVN equals SN. Since the real rate of surplus V value S equals the mass of surplus value divided by the variable capital versus that produced it, we can substitute in SN the equivalent of S, and V arrive at the further formula, S equals SN dot V. However, by turning over 10 times, and hence repeating its advance 10 times, the capital of £500 performs the function of a capital 10 times as great, a capital of £5,000, just as 500 shilling pieces that turn over 10 times in the year perform the same function as 5,000 turning over only once. 2. The turnover of an individual versus ARIABLE capital. Whatever the social form of the production process, it has to be continuous, it must periodically repeat the same phases. When viewed, therefore, as a connected whole, and in the constant flux of its incessant renewal, every social process of production is at the same time a process of reproduction. As a periodic increment of the value of the capital, or a periodic fruit borne by capital in process, surplus value acquires the form of a revenue arising out of capital. Volume 1, Chapter 23, pp. 711-12. We have 10 5-week turnover periods for capital A. In the first turnover period, £500 variable capital is advanced, i.e. £100 is converted each week into labor power, so that at the end of the first turnover 384 the turnover of capital period, £500 has been spent on labor power. This £500, originally part of the total capital advanced, has ceased to be capital. It has been paid out in wages. The workers, for their part, pay it out again in purchasing their means of subsistence, and consume means of subsistence to the value of £500. A mass of commodities amounting altogether to this value is thereby annihilated. What the worker may save as money, etc. is also not capital. This mass of commodities is consumed unproductively, as far as the worker is concerned, except inasmuch as he thereby maintains his labor power, which is an indispensable instrument for the capitalist in working condition. In the second place, however, this £500 is converted, for the capitalist, into labor power of the same value, or price. He consumes the labor power productively in the labor process. At the end of the 5 weeks, a value product of £1,000 has been brought into existence. Half of this, £500, is the reproduct value of the variable capital spent as payment for labor power. The other half, £500, is newly produced surplus value. But the 5 weeks labor power, by conversion into which a part of capital has been transformed into variable capital, is also spent or consumed, even if productively. The labor active yesterday is not the same labor as is active today. Its value, together with the surplus value created by it, now exists as the value of a thing distinct from labor power, the product. But because the product is transformed into money, the part of its value equal to the value of the variable capital advanced is converted once more into labor power and hence functions afresh as variable capital. The fact that the capital value that is not only reproduct, but also transformed back into the money form, may engage the same workers, the same bearers of labor power, is beside the point. It is quite possible for the capitalist to employ new workers in place of the old ones in the second turnover period. In fact, therefore, in the course of the 10 5-week turnover periods a capital of £5,000 is successively spent on wages, and not one of £500, these wages being spent again by the workers on means of subsistence. The capital of £5,000 advanced in this way is conswin. It no longer exists. On the other hand, it is labor power to the value of £5,000, and not just £500, that is successively incorporated into the production process, not only reproducing its own value of £5,000, but producing in addition to this a surplus value of £5,000. The variable capital of £500 that is advanced in the second turnover period is not the identical capital of £500 advanced in the first turnover period. The latter has been consumed, spent on wages. But it has been replaced by a new. The turnover of variable capital 385 variable capital of £500, which was produced in the first turnover period in the commodity form and was then transformed back into the money form. This new money capital of £500 is therefore the money form of the mass of commodities newly produced in the first turnover period. The fact that an identical money sum of £500 exists once more in the hands of the capitalist, if we disregard the surplus value, the same amount of money capital as he originally advanced, conceals the fact that he is operating with a newly produced capital. As far as the other value components of the commodity capital are concerned, those that replace the constant parts of the capital, their value is not newly produced, it is only the form in which the value exists that is changed. Let us take the third turnover period. Here it is evident that the variable capital of £500 advanced for the third time is not an old capital, but one newly produced, for it is the money form of the mass of commodities produced in the second turnover period and not in the first turnover period, the money form of that mass of commodities whose value is equal to the value of the variable capital advanced. The part of their value that equals the variable part of the capital advanced was converted into the new labor power for the second turnover period, and produced a new mass of commodities. This was again sold, and a part of their value forms the capital of £500 advanced in the third turnover period. The same thing happens for all 10 turnover periods. Every 5 weeks, newly produced masses of commodities, whose value, insofar as it replaces variable capital, is also newly produced, and does not simply reappear, as with the constant circulating capital, are thrown on the market, so that ever new labor power can be incorporated into the production process. What is attained by the tenfold turnover of the variable capital advanced, therefore, is not that this capital of £500 can be productively consumed 10 times over or that a variable capital that suffices for 5 weeks can be applied for 50. In fact, 10x £500 of variable capital is applied in the 50 weeks. The capital of £500 is only ever sufficient for 5 weeks, and must be replaced at the end of these 5 weeks with a newly produced capital of £500. This occurs just as much for capital A as for capital B, but now comes the difference. At the close of the first section of 5 weeks, a variable capital of £500 has been advanced and spent both in case B and in case A. For B, just as for A, its value has been converted into labor power and replaced by part of the value of the product newly produced by this 386, the turnover of capital labor power equal in value to the advanced variable capital of £500. For both B and A, the labor power has not just replaced the value of the variable capital expended, £500, with a new value to the same amount, but also added to it a surplus value, one of the same size, according to our assumption. In case B, however, the value product which replaces the variable capital advanced and adds to its value a surplus value does not exist in the form in which it can function once again as productive capital, as variable capital. This is the form in which it does exist for A. For B, however, through to the end of the year, while the variable capital spent in the first 5 weeks, and then successively every 5 weeks again, is replaced by newly produced value and surplus value, it does not exist in the form in which it can function as productive capital or in particular variable capital. Its value has certainly been replaced by a new value, and thus renewed, but the form of its value, in this case the absolute value form, its money form, has not been renewed. For the second period of 5 weeks, and successively for every 5 weeks during the year, a further £500 must be on hand, just as for the first period. If we ignore credit, then £5,000 must be on hand at the beginning of the year, and exist as latent money capital advanced, even though it is only actually spent and converted into labor power bit by bit in the course of the year. In case A, on the other hand, since the circuit or turnover of the capital advanced has been completed, the replacement value already exists, after 5 weeks have elapsed, in the form in which it can set in motion new labor power for 5 weeks, in its original money form. In both cases, A and B, new labor power is consumed in the second 5-week period, and a new capital of £500 spent in payment for this labor power. The workers' means of subsistence, which were paid for with the first £500, have disappeared, or at any rate the value of these has vanished from the hands of the capitalist. The second £500 serves to buy new labor power, to withdraw new means of subsistence from the market. In short, a new capital of £500 is spent, not the old one. But in case A, this new capital is the money form of the newly product replacement value for the £500 spent previously. In case B, the replacement value exists in a form in which it cannot function as variable capital. It does exist, but not in the form of variable capital. An additional capital of £500 must therefore be available in the money form, which is here unavoidable, to continue the production process for the next 5 weeks, and it must be advanced as such. Thus the same. The turnover of variable capital 387 amount of variable capital is spent in 50 weeks in case B as in case A, the same amount of labor power paid for and used. But in B this has to be paid for with a capital advance equal to its entire value, £5,000. In A, however, it is paid for successively by the ever-renewed money form of the replacement value that is produced every 5 weeks for the capital of £500 advanced for each 5 weeks. In this case, therefore, the money capital advanced is never greater than that needed for 5 weeks, never greater than the capital of £500 advanced for the first 5 weeks. This £500 is sufficient for the whole year. It is clear, therefore, that with the same degree of exploitation of labor, the same real rate of surplus value, the annual rates in cases A and B must stand in inverse proportion to the magnitudes of the variable money capitals that have had to be advanced in order to set in motion the same. 5,0008 quantity of labor power over the year. A equals 1000% and 500 v 5,0008 B equals 100%, but 500 v 5000 v equals 110 equals 100%, 1005 %. The distinction arises from the divergence in the turnover periods, the intervals at which the replacement value of the variable capital applied in a certain period of time can function afresh as capital, and therefore as new capital. With both B and A, we find the same replacement value for the variable capital applied during the same period. There is also the same additional surplus value produced during the same period. But with B, even though every 5 weeks there is a replacement value of £500, plus £500 surplus value, this replacement value does not yet form any new capital, since it does not exist in the money form. In case A, the old capital value is not only replaced by a new one, but is re-established in its money form, and hence replaced as new capital capable of performing its function. The earlier or later transformation of the replacement value into money, and hence into the form in which the variable capital is advanced, is evidently a circumstance quite immaterial to the production of surplus value. The latter depends on the magnitude of the variable capital applied, and on the level of exploitation of labor. But the circumstance mentioned above does modify the size of the money capital that has to be advanced in order to set in motion a definite amount of labor power in the course of the year, and in this way it does affect the annual rate of surplus value. 388 The turnover of capital 3. The turnover of variable capital considered from the social point of view. Let us consider the matter for a moment from the whole society's standpoint. A worker costs, say, £1 per week. The working day is 10 hours. Both with capital A and capital B 100 workers are employed throughout the year, £100 per week for 100 workers, making £500 for 5 weeks and £5,000 for 50 weeks, and each of these works for 60 hours in a 6-day week. 100 workers perform 6,000 hours labor per week and therefore 300,000 hours labor in 50 weeks. This labor power is requisitioned by A and B, and cannot be spent by the society on anything else. In this respect, the matter is the same, from the social standpoint, for both A and B. Moreover, in both cases, each 100 workers receive a yearly wage of £5,000, thus the 200 together receive £10,000, and withdraw from society means of subsistence to this value. In this respect, too, the matter is equivalent in both cases, from the social standpoint. Since the workers are in both cases paid by the week, they also withdraw means of subsistence from society each week, and each week they cast into circulation in return their money equivalent. But now comes the difference. Firstly, the money that the workers under capital A cast into circulation is not only, as for the workers under capital B, the money fund of the value of their labor power, in actual fact a means of payment for labor already performed, right from the second turnover period onward, reckoning from the opening of the business, it is the money form of their own value product, equals price of labor power plus surplus value, in the first turnover period which pays for their labor during the second turnover period. With capital B the position is different. Here, too, the money is certainly a means of payment for labor that the workers have already performed, but this labor is not paid for with their own value product turned into money, the money form of the value they themselves have produced. This can only start to happen from the second year onwards, when the workers under capital B are paid with their own value product of the previous year, converted into money. The shorter the turnover period of the capital and hence the shorter the intervals at which its reproduction period is repeated in the course of the year, the sooner is the variable part of the capital originally advanced by the capitalist in the money form transformed into the money form of the value product created by the worker as a replace. The turnover of variable capital 389 meant for this variable capital, this product also including surplus value, the shorter, too, is the time for which the capitalist has to advance money from his own funds, and the smaller the total capital that he advances in relation to the given scale of production, the relatively greater, therefore, is the mass of surplus value that the capitalist extracts in the course of the year, at a given rate of surplus value, since he can buy the workers all the more often, and set their labor in motion, with the money form of their own value product. At a given scale of production, the absolute size of the variable money capital advanced, and so of the circulating capital in general, is reduced in proportion to the brevity of the turnover period, and the annual rate of surplus value correspondingly grows. With a given volume of capital advanced, the scale of production grows, and hence, with a given rate of surplus value, the absolute mass of the surplus value produced in one turnover period also grows, and there occurs, simultaneously with this, a rise in the annual rate of surplus value caused by the reduction in the reproduction period. The preceding investigation has led us to the result that, according to the varying magnitudes of the turnover period, money capitals of very different scale have to be advanced, in order to set in motion the same volume of productive circulating capital and the same amount of labor, given the same level of exploitation of labor. Secondly, and this is related to the first distinction, in both cases the workers pay for the means of subsistence that they buy with the variable capital that is transformed in their hands into means of circulation. They not only withdraw wheat from the market, for example, but also replace it with an equivalent in money. But since the money with which the workers employed by capital B pay for their means of subsistence and withdraw them from the market is not the money form of their own value product cast into the market in the course of the year, as is the case with the workers employed by capital A, it follows that although they supply the seller of their means of subsistence with money, they do not supply any commodity, either means of production or means of subsistence, which he could buy with the money provided, which is the position however with a hence labor power, means of subsistence for this labor power, fixed capital in the form of the means of labor applied under capital B, and production materials, are all withdrawn from the market, and an equivalent in money is cast into the market to replace them with, but no product is cast into the market during the year in question to replace the material elements of Pro 390 the turnover of capital productive capital withdrawn from it. If we were to consider a communist society in place of a capitalist one, then money capital would immediately be done away with, and so too the disguises that transactions acquire through it. The adder would be simply reduced to the fact that the society must reckon in advance how much labor, means of production and means of subsistence it can spend, without dislocation, on branches of industry which, like the building of railways, for instance, supply neither means of production nor means of subsistence, nor any kind of useful effect, for a long period, a year or more, though they certainly do withdraw labor, means of production and means of subsistence from the total annual product. In capitalist society, on the other hand, where any kind of social rationality asserts itself only post festum, major disturbances can and must occur constantly. On the one hand there is pressure on the money market, while conversely the absence of this pressure itself calls into being a mass of such undertakings, and therefore the precise circumstances that later provoke a pressure on the money market. The money market is under pressure because large-scale advances of money capital for long periods of time are always needed here. This is quite apart from the fact that industrialists and merchants throw the money capital they need for the carrying on of their businesses into railway speculations, etc., and replace it with loans from the money market. The other side of the coin is pressure on the society's available productive capital. Since elements of productive capital are constantly being withdrawn from the market and all that is put into the market is an equivalent in money, the effective demand rises, without this in itself providing any element of supply. Hence prices rise, both for the means of subsistence and for the material elements of production. During this time, too, there are regular business swindles and great transfers of capital. A band of speculators, contractors, engineers, lawyers, etc. enrich themselves. These exert a strong consumer demand on the market, and wages rise as well. As far as foodstuffs are concerned, agriculture is given a boost by this process. But since these foodstuffs cannot be suddenly increased within the year, imports grow, as well as the import of exotic foods, coffee, sugar, wine, etc., and objects of luxury. Hence oversupply and speculation in this part of the import trade. On the other hand, in those branches of industry in which production can be increased more quickly, manufacture proper, mining, literally, after the feast, a favorite expression of Marx's, in the sense of too late to have any effect. The turnover of variable capital 391 etc. The price rise leads to sudden expansion, soon followed by collapse. The same effect occurs on the labor market, drawing great numbers of the latent relative surplus population, and even workers already employed, into the new lines of business. Undertakings of this kind, such as railways, generally withdraw from the labor market on a large scale a certain quantity of force, which can derive only from branches such as agriculture, etc., where only strong lads are needed. This still occurs even after the new undertakings have already become an established branch of industry and the migrant working class needed for them has already been formed, e.g. when railway construction is temporarily pursued on a scale greater than the average. A part of the reserve army of workers whose pressure keeps wages down is absorbed. Wages generally rise, even in the formerly well-employed sections of the labor market. This lasts until, with the inevitable crash, the reserve army of workers is again released and wages are pressed down once more to their minimum and below it. 1. Inasmuch as the greater or lesser length of the turnover period depends on the working period in the strict sense, i.e. the period needed to prepare the product for the market. It depends on the material conditions of production in the various spheres of capital investment, as these are given at the time. In agriculture, these have more the character of natural conditions of production. In manufacture, and for the most part in the extractive industries too, they change with the social development of the productive process itself. Inasmuch as the length of the working period depends on the size of deliveries, on the quantitative scale on which the product is generally thrown onto the market, this has a conventional character. That the convention itself has as its material basis the scale of production, and is therefore accidental only if considered in isolation. Finally, inasmuch as the length of the turnover period is dependent one. The following note for future elaboration is here inserted in the manuscript: contradiction in the capitalist mode of production. The workers are important for the market as buyers of commodities, but as sellers of their commodity. Habor power, capitalist society has the tendency to restrict them to their minimum price. Further contradiction. The periods in which capitalist production exerts all its forces regularly show themselves to be periods of overproduction, because the limit to the application of the productive powers is not simply the production of value, but also its realization. However, the sale of commodities, the realization of commodity capital, and thus of surplus value as well, is restricted not by the consumer needs of society in general, but by the consumer needs of a society in which the great majority are always poor and must always remain poor. This, however, belongs rather to the next part. 392. The turnover of capital on the length of the circulation period. This is partly conditioned by the constant change in market conditions, the greater or lesser ease of selling, and the necessity, which arises from this, of casting the product partly on nearer and partly on more distant markets. Apart from the scale of demand in general, the movement of prices plays a major role here. Sales are deliberately restricted when prices are falling, while production goes ahead, and the converse occurs when prices are rising, when production and sale keep in step, or selling even takes place in advance. However, the actual distance of the place of production from the market outlet should be considered as a specific material basis. English cotton cloth or yarn, for instance, is sold to India. The export merchant has to pay the English cotton manufacturer. He does this willingly only when the situation on the money market is favorable. As soon as the manufacturer himself replaces his money capital by credit operations, things start to go wrong. The exporter later sells his cotton goods on the Indian market, from where the capital he has advanced is remitted. Until this reflux, the situation is just the same as one in which the length of the working period requires a new advance of money capital in order to keep the production process going on the same scale. The money capital with which the manufacturer pays his workers and replaces the other elements of his circulating capital is not the money form of the yarn that he produced. This can only be the case after the value of this yarn has returned to England in money or products. It is additional money capital, as before. The distinction is simply that instead of the manufacturer it is the merchant who advances it, and he may well have obtained it himself by credit operations. Similarly, until this money has been cast into the market, no additional product has been put on the English market that could be bought with this money and enter the sphere of production or individual consumption. If this condition sets in for a long while and on a large scale, then it must lead to the same results as the prolonged working period did previously. It is also possible that the yam is sold on credit in India itself. With this credit, products are bought in India and sent as a return shipment to England, or else drafts are remitted to this amount. If this process is delayed, then pressure builds up on the Indian money market, which may react on England to produce a crisis here. This crisis, in its turn, even if it is combined with the export of precious metals to India, provokes a new crisis in that country, on account of the bankruptcy of English firms and their Indian branches, who were given credit by Indian banks. Thus a simultaneous crisis arises both on the market for the turnover of variable capital 393 which the trade balance is unfavorable, and on that for which it is favorable. This phenomenon can be still more complicated. England may have sent silver bullion to India, but India's English creditors now press their demands here, and in a short while India will have to send its silver back to England. It can happen that the export trade to India and the import trade from India are in approximate balance, even though the size of the latter, with the exception of special circumstances such as an increase in cotton prices, etc., is determined by the former, and stimulated by it. The balance of trade between England and India may appear in equilibrium, or exhibit only weak fluctuations on one side or the other. But once the crisis breaks out in England, it becomes clear that unsold cotton goods are being stored up in India, goods which have therefore not been transformed from commodity capital into money capital. Overproduction on this side, and that on the other hand there are not only unsold stocks of Indian products in England, but a major part of stocks sold and consumed have not yet been paid for. Thus what appears as a crisis on the money market in actual fact expresses anomalies in the production and reproduction process itself. Thirdly, in relation to the actual circulating capital applied, both variable and constant, the length of the turnover period, insofar as it derives from the length of the working period, leads to the distinction that, with a greater number of turnovers in the course of the year, an element of the variable or constant circulating capital can be supplied by way of its own product, as with the production of coal, of ready-made clothes, etc. In other situations this is not the case, at least not within the year. Chapter 17. The circulation of surplus value. We have already seen how the variation in the turnover period produces a variation in the annual rate of surplus value, even with the mass of surplus value annually produced remaining the same. There is, however, a further necessary variation in the capitalization of surplus value, in accumulation, and in this respect also in the mass of surplus value produced during the year, even with the rate of surplus value remaining the same. We note first of all that capitalist A, in the example of the preceding chapter, has a steady periodic revenue, and so, if we accept the turnover period with which he starts business, he meets his own consumption during the year out of his production of surplus value, and does not have to advance anything for this out of his own funds. This is the position, however, with B. Capitalist B produces the same amount of surplus value in the same time as it is, but the surplus value is not realized and can therefore be consumed neither individually nor productively. So far as individual consumption is concerned, surplus value is anticipated. Funds for this must be advanced. A part of the productive capital which it is difficult to categorize, i.e. the extra capital needed for repair and maintenance of the fixed capital, now presents itself in a new light. Asterisk. In case A, this part of the capital is either not advanced at the start of production, or is only advanced to a small extent. It does not need to be available, let alone actually present. It arises from the business itself, by the direct transformation of surplus value into capital, i.e. its direct application as capital. A part of the surplus value that is not only product periodically in the course of the year, but also realized, can cover the expenses necessary for repairs, etc. In this way, a part of the capital needed to conduct the business on its original scale is produced by the business itself, in the course of business, by the capitalization of a part. See above, page 255. The circulation of surplus value 395 of the surplus value. This is impossible for capitalist B. The portion of capital in question must in his case form part of the capital originally advanced. In both cases, this part of the capital figures in the capitalist's books as capital advanced, which indeed it is, since on our assumption it forms part of the productive capital needed to carry on business on the given scale. But it makes a great difference whose funds it is advanced out of. In case B, it is an actual part of the capital that has to be originally advanced or kept available. In case A, on the other hand, it is a portion of the surplus value applied as capital. This latter case shows us how not only the capital accumulated, but also a part of the capital originally advanced, can be simply capitalized surplus value. Once the development of credit intervenes, the relation between the capital originally advanced and the capitalized surplus value becomes still more intricate. For example, A may borrow part of the productive capital with which he begins his business, or carries it on during the year, from banker C at the start. Therefore, he lacks sufficient capital of his own to conduct the business. Banker C lends him a sum that simply consists of surplus value deposited with him by industrialists D, E, F, etc. From A's standpoint, it is still not accumulated capital. In point of fact, however, for D, E, F, etc., A is no more than an agent who capitalizes the surplus value that they have appropriated. In Chapter 24 of Volume 1 we saw how the real content of accumulation, the transformation of surplus value into capital, is the reproduction process on an expanded scale, whether this expansion expresses itself extensively in the form of the addition of new factories to old ones, or intensively in the enlargement of the former scale of operate ions. The expansion of the scale of production can proceed in relatively small doses, if a part of the surplus value is applied to improvements way either simply raise the productive power of the labor applied, or allow it simultaneously to be more intensively exploited. Alternatively, when the working day is not restricted by law, an additional outlay of circulating capital, in production materials and wages, permits an expansion of the scale of production without any increase in the fixed capital, since the time during which the latter is used is thus simply prolonged, while its turnover period is correspondingly shortened. Alternatively, again, the capitalized surplus value, given favorable market conjunctures, may permit speculation in raw materials, operations for which the capital originally advanced would have been insufficient, and so on. See Volume 1, pp. 725-34. 396 The turnover of capital. It is clear, however, that where a relatively large number of turnover periods brings about a more frequent realization of surplus value in the course of the year, periods do occur in which the working day cannot be extended, nor can individual improvements be brought about. While, on the other hand, extension of the whole business on a proportional scale, partly by expanding the entire plant, the buildings, for example, partly by increasing the labor fund, as in agriculture, is possible only within certain limits, which may be broader or narrower, and requires a volume of additional capital that can only be supplied by several years' accumulation of surplus value. Besides real accumulation, or the transformation of surplus value into productive capital, and, correspondingly, reproduction on an expanded scale, there is thus accumulation of money, scraping together a part of the surplus value as latent money capital, which is only to function as additional active capital later on, when it has attained a certain volume. This is how the matter appears from the standpoint of the individual capitalist. With the development of capitalist production, however, there occurs a simultaneous development in the credit system. The money capital that the capitalist cannot yet apply in his own business is employed by others from whom he receives interest. It functions for him as money capital in the specific sense that it is a kind of capital distinct from productive capital. But it is in someone else's hands that it actually operates as capital. It is clear that, with the more frequent realization of surplus value and the rising scale on which it is produced, a growth occurs in the proportion in which new money capital or money as capital is placed on the money market, and at least a large part of this is absorbed again from the money market for the expansion of production. The simplest form which this extra latent money capital can assume is that of a hoard. This hoard may be additional gold or silver received directly or indirectly in exchange with the countries producing precious metals. It is only in this way, moreover, that the money hoard within a country grows in absolute terms. It is possible, on the other hand, however, and this is the position in the majority of cases, that this hoard is nothing more than money withdrawn from domestic circulation which has assumed the form of a hoard in the hands of individual capitalists. It is also possible that this latent money capital consists simply of value tokens. We are still leaving credit money out of account here, or else of mere claims, titles, of the capitalist on third parties. The circulation of surplus value 397 established by legal documents. In all these cases, whatever may be the form of existence of the extra money capital, it represents, inasmuch as it is prospective capital, no more than extra legal titles to the future additional production of the society that the capitalists hold in reserve. The mass of real accumulated wealth, in point of magnitude, is so utterly insignificant when compared with the powers of production of the same society in whatever state of civilization, or even compared with the actual consumption for even a few years of that society, that the great attention of legislators and political economists should be directed to productive powers, and their future free development, and not, as hitherto, to the mere accumulated wealth that strikes the eye. Of what is called accumulated wealth, by far the greater part is only nominal, consisting not of any real things, ships, houses, cottons, improvements on land, but of mere demands on the future annual productive powers of society, engendered and perpetuated by the expedients or institutions of insecurity. The use of such articles, accumulations of physical things or actual wealth, as a mere means of appropriating to their possessors the wealth to be created by the future productive powers of society, being that alone of which the natural laws of distribution would, without force, gradually deprive them, or, if aided by cooperative labor, would in a very few years deprive them. William Thomson, An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth, London, 1850, page 453. This book originally appeared in 1824. It is little thought, by most persons not at all suspected, how very small a proportion, either in extent or influence, the actual accumulations of society bear to human productive powers, even to the ordinary consumption of a few years of a single generation. The reason is obvious, but the effect very pernicious. The wealth that is annually consumed, disappearing with its consumption, is seen but for a moment, and makes no impression but during the act of enjoyment or use. But that part of wealth which is of slow consumption, furniture, machinery, buildings, from childhood to old age stand out before the eye, the durable monuments of human exertion. By means of the possession of this fixed, permanent, or slowly consumed, part of national wealth, of the land and materials to work upon, the tools to work with, the houses to shelter whilst working, the holders of these articles command for their own benefit the yearly productive powers of all the really efficient productive laborers of society, though these articles may bear ever so small a proportion to the recurring products of that labor. The population of Britain and Ireland being 20 millions, the average 398 the turnover of capital consumption of each individual, man, woman, and child, is probably about £20, making 400 millions of wealth, the product of labor annually consumed. The whole amount of the AC accumulated capital of these countries, it has been estimated, does not exceed 1,200 millions, or 3 times the year's labor of the community, or, if equally divided, £60 capital for every individual. 'Tis with the proportions, rather than with the absolute accurate amount of these estimated sums, we are concerned. The interest of this capital stock would support the whole population in the same comfort in which they now exist, for about 2 months of 1 year, and the whole accumulated capital itself would maintain them in idleness, could purchasers be found, for 3 years, at the end of which time, without houses, clothes, or food, they must starve, or become the slaves of those who supported them in the 3 years' idleness. As 3 years to the life of one healthy generation, say 40 years, so is the magnitude and importance of the actual wealth, the accumulated capital of even the wealthiest community, to the productive powers of only one generation, not of what, under judicious arrangements of equal security, they might produce, particularly with the aid of cooperative labor, but of what, under the defective and depressing expedients of insecurity, they do absolutely produce. The seeming mighty mass of existing capital to maintain and perpetuate which, are rather the command of the products of yearly labor which it serves as the means of engrossing. In its present state of forced division, are all the horrible machinery, the vices, crimes, and miseries of insecurity, sought to be perpetuated. As nothing can be accumulated without first supplying necessaries, and as the great current of human inclination is to enjoyment, hence the comparatively trifling amount of the actual wealth of society at any particular moment. 'Tis an eternal round of production and consumption. From the amount of this immense mass of annual consumption and production, the handful of actual accumulation would hardly be missed, and yet it is to this handful, and not to the mass of productive powers that attention has chiefly been directed. This handful, however, having been seized upon, by a few, and been made the instrument of converting to their use the constantly recurring annual products of the labor of the great majority of their fellow creatures, hence, in the opinion of these few, the paramount importance of such an instrument. About 1/3 part of the annual products of the labor of these countries is now abstracted from the producers, under the name of public burdens, and unproductively consumed by those who give no The circulation of surplus value 399 equivalent, that is to say, none satisfactory to the producers. With the accumulated masses, particularly when held forth in the hands of a few individuals, the vulgar eye has been always struck. The annually produced and consumed masses, like the eternal and incalculable waves of a mighty river, roll on and are lost in the forgotten ocean of consumption. On this eternal consumption, however, are dependent, not only for almost all gratifications, but even for existence, the whole human race. The quantity and distribution of these yearly products ought to be the paramount objects of consideration. The actual AC accumulation is altogether of secondary importance, and derives almost the whole of that importance from its influence on the distribution of the yearly productions. Actual accumulations and distributions have been always considered, in Thomson's works, in reference and subordinate to the power of producing. In almost all other systems, the power of producing has been considered in reference and subordinate to actual accumulations and to the perpetuating of the existing modes of distribution. In comparison to the preservation of this actual distribution, the ever-recurring misery or happiness of the whole human race has been considered as unworthy of regard. To perpetuate the results of force, fraud, and chance, has been called security, and to the support of this spurious security, have all the productive powers of the human race been unrelentingly sacrificed. Ibid. pp. 440-43. As far as reproduction is concerned, only two normal cases are possible, leaving aside disturbances which inhibit reproduction even on the existing scale. Either reproduction occurs on a simple scale, or alternatively, there is capitalization of surplus value, accumulation. Simple reproduction. In the case of simple reproduction, the surplus value that is periodic ally produced and realized, either annually or by several turnovers within the year, as consumed individually, unproductively, by its owners, the capitalists. The fact that the value of products consists partly of surplus value, and partly of the portion of value formed by the variable capital reproduct in it together with the constant capital consumed, does not change in the least either the volume or the value of the total product 400 the turnover of capital which enters circulation at any given time as commodity capital and is similarly withdrawn from it to go into productive or individual consumption, to serve as means of production or means of consumption. Leaving aside the constant capital, it is only the distribution of the annual product between workers and capitalists that is thereby affected. Even supposing simple reproduction, one part of the surplus value must always exist in money and not in products, because it cannot otherwise be transformed from money into products for the needs of consumption. This transformation of surplus value from its original commodity form into money must now be investigated further. To simplify the matter, we take the problem in its simplest form, the exclusive circulation of metallic money, of money that is a real equivalent. According to the laws developed for simple commodity circulation, Volume 1, Chapter 3, the mass of metallic money existing in a country cannot just be enough to circulate the commodities. It must be sufficient to cope with fluctuations in the circulation of money, which arise partly from fluctuations in the speed of circulation, partly from changes in the price of commodities, and partly from the different and changing proportions in which the money functions as means of payment and as means of circulation proper. The ratio in which the existing mass of money is divided into a hoard and into money in circulation constantly changes, but the mass of money is always equal to the sum of money present as a hoard and as money in circulation. This quantity of money, the quantity of precious metal, as a social hoard accumulated bit by bit. Inasmuch as a part of this hoard is consumed by wear and tear, it must be replaced each year, as with any other product. This happens in reality by the direct or indirect exchange of a part of the annual product of the country in question with the product of the gold and silver producing countries. The international character of this transaction conceals its simple course. In order to reduce the problem to its simplest and most perceptible expression, we must therefore assume that there is production of gold and silver in the country itself, That gold and silver production forms a part of the total social production of any country. Ignoring the gold and silver produced for luxury articles, the minimum annual production of these metals must be equal to the wear and tear of the money metals occasioned by the annual monetary circulation. Moreover, if the value of the mass of commodities annually produced and circulated grows, then the annual production of gold and silver must also grow, in so far as the increased value of the circulation of surplus value 401 commodities in circulation and the quantity of money required for this circulation, and for the corresponding hoard formation, is not compensated for by a greater velocity of monetary circulation and by the more comprehensive function of money as means of payment, by more mutual settlement of sales and purchases without the intervention of actual money. A part of the social labor power and a part of the social means of production must therefore be spent each year in the production of gold and silver. The capitalists who pursue the production of gold and silver, and since we are here assuming simple reproduction, they pursue it only within the bounds of the average annual wear and tear and the average annual consumption of gold and silver necessitated by that wear and tear. Directly cast their surplus value, which according to our supposition they consume each year without capitalizing any of it, into the circulation sphere in the money form, which is for them the natural form of their product, not, as with the other branches of production, its transformed form. Furthermore, as far as wages are concerned, the money form in which the variable capital is advanced. Here too they are not replaced by the sale of the product, its transformation into money, but rather by product whose natural form is money from the very beginning. Finally, this also applies to the part of the total precious metal product that is equal in value to the whole of the constant capital periodically consumed, including both the constant circulating capital and the constant fixed capital consumed during the year. Let us firstly consider the circuit or turnover of the capital invested in the production of precious metals in the form MC. P. M. Insofar as the C in MC does not consist only of labor power and means of production, but also of fixed capital, only a part of whose value is used up in P, it is evident that M. The product is a sum of money equal to the variable capital laid out on wages, plus the circulating constant capital laid out on means of production, plus the portion of value of the fixed capital used up, plus the surplus value. If the sum were smaller, with the general value of the gold unchanged, then the mines in question would be unprofitable, or, if this is generally the case, the value of gold would in future rise, compared with commodities whose value was unchanged. The prices of commodities would fall, so that the sum of money laid out in MC would in future be less. 402 The turnover of capital. Let us start by considering only the circulating part of the capital advanced in M, the starting point of MC. P. M. In this case, a certain sum of money is advanced and cast into circulation in payment for labor power and in order to purchase materials of production. The money is not withdrawn again from circulation by the circuit of this capital, and then cast in afresh. The product in its natural form is already money, it does not need to be first transformed into money by exchange, by process of circulation. It moves from the production process into the circulation sphere not in the form of commodity capital that has to be transformed back into money capital, but rather as money capital that has to be transformed back into productive capital, has to buy new labor power and materials of production. The money form of the circulating capital, that consumed in labor power and means of production, is replaced not by the sale of the product, but rather by the natural form of the product itself, not by withdrawing its value again from circulation in the money form, but rather by adding money newly produced. Let us assume that this circulating capital is £500, and the turnover period 5 weeks, a 4-week working period, with the circulation period only 1 week. Right from the start, money has in part to be advanced for 5 weeks in a production stock, and in part kept on hand to be paid out bit by bit as wages. At the beginning of the 6th week, £400 has returned and £100 been set free. This is continually repeated. Here, as before, £100 always exists in the released form for a certain section of the turnover. But this consists of additional money newly produced, just like the other £400. Here we have 10 turnovers in the year, and the annual product is £5,000 in gold. The circulation period here does not arise from the time taken to transform commodities into money, but rather that taken to transform money into elements of production. For any other capital of £500, turning over under the same conditions, the constantly renewed money form is the changed form of the commodity capital produced, a capital which is cast into circulation every 4 weeks and always receives this money form afresh by its sale. By the periodic withdrawal of the sum of money in the shape of which it HY entered the process. Here, on the contrary, in every turnover period a new additional sum of £500 in money is cast into circulation by the production process, so as to keep withdrawing materials of production and labor power from circulation. The money thus cast into the circulation sphere is not withdrawn from it again by the circuit. The circulation of or plus value 403 of this capital, but rather by the increased quantity of new gold that is constantly produced. If we consider the variable part of this circulating capital and take it to be £100, as above, then this £100 would in ordinary commodity production be sufficient to pay labor power through a 10-fold turnover. Here, in money production, the same sum is also sufficient, however the 5-weekly reflux of £100 with which the labor power is paid is not the changed form of its product, but rather a part of its ever-new product itself. The gold producer pays his workers directly with a part of the gold they have themselves produced. Thus, the £1,000 that is laid out each year on labor power and thrown into circulation by the workers does not return via circulation to its starting point. As far as the fixed capital is concerned, moreover, the initial establishment of the business requires the expenditure of a relatively large money capital, which is thus cast into the circulation sphere. Like all fixed capital, this only returns back bit by bit over a number of years. But it flows back as a direct fragment of the product, the gold, not by the sale of the product and its consequent conversion into monetary form. Thus it does not receive its money form by withdrawal of money from circulation, but rather by the accumulation of a corresponding part of the product. The money capital thus re-established is not a sum of money gradually withdrawn from circulation to balance the sum of money originally cast into it for fixed capital. It is an additional quantity of money. Finally, as far as the surplus value is concerned, this is also equal to a part of the new gold product that is cast into circulation in each new turnover period, to be spent unproductively, according to our assumption, and paid out for means of subsistence and luxury articles. According to our assumption, however, this entire annual gold production, through which labor power and materials of production, though not money, are steadily withdrawn from the market, and additional money is steadily supplied to it, only replaces the money worn out during the year, and thus simply keeps intact the social money stock which always exists in the two forms of hoard and money in circulation, though in varying proportions. According to the law of commodity circulation, the total quantity of money must be equal to the quantity of money required for circulation plus a sum of money existing in the hoard form which increases or decreases according to the contraction or expansion of circulation, and serves in particular for the formation of the reserve fund of means of 404 the turnover of capital payment that is needed. What has to be paid in money? Insofar as there is no direct balancing of accounts, is the value of the commodities. The fact that part of this value consists of surplus value, has cost the seller of the commodity nothing, does not change this situation in any way. If the producers all possessed their means of production independently, there would then be circulation between the direct producers themselves. Ignoring the constant part of their capital, we could divide their annual surplus product, by analogy with the situation under capitalism, into two parts. Part A, which simply replaces their necessary means of subsistence, and Part B, which they partly consume as luxury products, and partly apply to the expansion of production. Part A then represents the variable capital, Part B, the surplus value. But this division would still have no effect on the quantity of money required to circulate their total product. With circumstances otherwise remaining the same, the value of the mass of commodities in circulation would be the same, and so would the quantity of money required by it. They would also have to have the same money reserves as before, given a similar division of the turnover period, The same part of their capital would always have to be in the money form. On our continued supposition that their production was commodity production. Thus, the circumstance that a part of the commodity value consists of surplus value does not alter in the least the quantity of money needed to carry on the business. An opponent of Tooke, who supports the form MCM, asked him how the capitalist always managed to withdraw more money from circulation than he cast into it. Let us be clear that what is involved here is not the formation of surplus value. This, the only real secret, is taken for granted by the capitalists. The sum of value invested would not be capital if it did not enrich itself with a surplus value. Hence, surplus value is assumed from the outset. Its existence is a matter of course. Thus, the question is not, where does surplus value come from? But rather, where does the money come from which it is turned into? In bourgeois economics, the existence of surplus value is taken for granted. Thus, not only is it presupposed, but it is also presupposed at the same time that a part of the mass of commodities cast into circulation consists of surplus product, and thus represents a value that the capitalist did not cast into circulation with his capital. That the capitalist therefore casts into circulation an excess over and above his capital, and withdraws this excess from it again. The circulation of surplus value 405 the commodity capital that the capitalist casts into circulation is of greater value. Why this should be so is not explained or understood from the capitalist's standpoint, but it is a fact for all that, than the productive capital he has withdrawn in labor power and means of production from the circulation sphere. On this assumption, it is therefore clear why not only capitalist A, but also B, C, D, etc. can always withdraw from circulation, by exchanging their commodities, more value than the value of their original capital, which is always advanced anew. A, B, C, D, etc. always cast a greater commodity value into circulation in the form of commodity capital, an operation which has as many sides to it as there are independently functioning capitals, than they withdraw from it in the form of productive capital. Thus, they always have a value sum to share among themselves, i.e. each of them can withdraw from circulation a productive capital, equal to the value of the productive capitals they have respectively advanced, and can just as regularly share out a value SWN which they cast into circulation from just as many sides in the commodity form, as a respective surplus of commodity value over the value of their commodities' elements of production. But before the commodity capital is transformed back into productive capital and the surplus value contained in it is spent, it must be turned into money. Where does the money for this come from? This question appears difficult at first glance, and neither Tooke nor anyone else has yet answered it. Assume that the circulating capital of £500 advanced in the form of money capital, whatever may be its turnover period, is the total circulating capital of society, i.e. of the capitalist class. The surplus value is £100. How then can the entire capitalist class continue extracting £600 from the circulation sphere, if it only ever puts £500 into it? Once the money capital of £500 has been transformed into productive capital, this is transformed within the production process into a commodity value of £600, and there now exists in the circulation sphere not only a commodity value of £500, equal to the money capital originally advanced, but also a newly produced surplus value of £100. This extra surplus value of £100 is cast into circulation in the commodity form. There is no doubt about that. But the extra money needed for the circulation of this additional commodity value is not provided by the same operation. This difficulty should not be circumvented by plausible subterfuges. For example, as far as concerns the constant circulating capital, it is 406 the turnover of capital clear that not all of it is laid out at the same time. While capitalist A is selling his commodities, and thus the capital he has advanced is assuming the money form, the capital of buyer B, which is present in the money form, is assuming the form of B's means of production, and it is A himself who produces these. By the same act through which A gives back its money form to the commodity capital he has produced, B gives his capital back its productive form, transforming it from the money form into means of production and labor power. the same sum of money functions in the two-way process just as in every simple sale. CM, on the other hand, if A transforms his money into means of production again, he buys from C, and this latter thereby pays B, etc. The transaction might thus appear to have been explained. However, none of the laws put forward with respect to the quantity of money circulating for the purpose of commodity circulation, v. Olvne 1, Chapter 3, are in any way altered by the capitalist character of the production process. Therefore, when it is said that the circulating capital advanced by society in the money form amounts to £500, it has already been taken into account that this is not only the sum which was advanced at the same time, but that this sum also sets more productive capital than £500 in motion, since it serves alternately as the money fund for different productive capitals. This mode of explanation already presupposes that the money exists, whereas it is precisely its existence that is to be explained. It might further be said that capitalist A produces articles that capitalist B consumes individually and unproductively. B's money thus turns A's commodity capital into money, and so the same sum of money serves to turn into money both B's surplus value and A's circulating constant capital. But here the solution to the question that is to be answered is presupposed even more directly. Namely, where does B get this money to meet his revenue? How did he himself manage to convert into money this part of his product's surplus value? It might be said, again, that the part of the circulating variable capital that advances at any one time to his workers constantly flows back to him from the circulation sphere. Only a changing part of it is kept back by him for the payment of wages. Between the outlay and the reflux there is however a certain interval, in the course of which the money paid out in wages can serve among other things to convert his surplus value into money. However, we know, firstly, that the greater this interval, the greater the circulation of surplus value. 407 must be the quantity of money in reserve which capitalist A must constantly retain in his possession. Secondly, if the workers pay the money out and buy commodities with it, the surplus value contained in these commodities is also proportionately converted into money. Thus the same money that is advanced in the form of variable capital also serves to that extent to convert the surplus value into money. Without going any deeper into the question here, it is at least clear that the consumption of the entire capitalist class and the unproductive persons dependent on it keeps even pace with that of the working class. Thus, on top of the money cast into circulation by the workers, money must be cast into circulation by the capitalists, if they are to spend their surplus value as revenue, and so money for this must be withdrawn from circulation. The explanation just given would only reduce the quantity needed, and not obviate the need. It might be said, finally, a large amount of money is always cast into circulation on the first investment of the fixed capital, and this is withdrawn from circulation again only gradually, bit by bit, in the course of several years, by whoever threw it in. Is this sum not sufficient to convert the surplus value? The answer to this is that the sum of £500, which also includes hoard formation for the necessary reserve fund, may well already imply the investment of this sum as fixed capital, if not by the person who cast it in, then at least by someone else. Besides, it is already presupposed, in connection with the sum that is spent on the acquisition of products serving as fixed capital, that the surplus value in these commodities is also paid for, and the question precisely arises, where does this money come from? The general answer has already been given. If a mass of commodities of X times £1,000 is to circulate, it in no way affects the quantity of money needed for this circulation whether the value of this commodity mass contains surplus value or not, or whether the mass of commodities is produced under capitalist conditions or not. Thus the problem itself does not exist. With conditions otherwise given, such as the velocity of circulation of the money, etc., a definite sum of money is required to circulate the commodity value of X times £1,000, quite irrespective of how much or how little of this value accrues to the direct producers of these commodities. Inasmuch as a problem does exist here, it coincides with the general problem. Where does the sum of money needed in a country for the circulation of commodities come from? However, there does exist, from the standpoint of capitalist production, the semblance of a special problem. For here it is the capitalist, the 408 the turnover of capital man who casts the money into circulation, who appears as the point of departure. The money that the worker spends in payment for his means of subsistence existed previously as the money form of the variable capital, and was therefore originally cast into circulation by the capital East as means of purchase or payment for labor power. Moreover, the money that the capitalist casts into circulation originally constituted the money form of his constant fixed and fluid capital. He spends it as means of purchase or payment for means of labor and production materials. Beyond this, however, the capitalist no longer appears as the point of departure for the quantity of money that exists in circulation. All that exists now are two starting points, the capitalist and the worker. All third parties either must receive money from these two classes for the performance of services, or, insofar as they receive money without providing services in return, they are co-proprietors of surplus value in the forms of rent, interest, etc. If the surplus value does not all remain in the pockets of the industrial capitalist, but has to be shared by him with other persons, this has nothing to do with the question at issue. What was asked is how he converts his surplus value